The call came on a Thursday morning in March. My bank. A woman named Patricia, from the fraud department, who spoke with the specific, careful warmth of someone who has made this kind of call before and knows that the person on the other end is about to receive information that will reorganize their understanding of the last several months. She said, "Mr. Holloway, I'm calling regarding some activity on your investment account. We've flagged a series of transfers that we'd like to walk you through." I said, "What kind of transfers?" She said, "Over the past 8 months, there have been 17 transfers out of your primary retirement account. The total amount is," she said the number. I sat down. Not because my legs gave out, because I am 67 years old and I have spent 38 years working in federal financial compliance. And I recognized immediately, in the way that you recognize the shape of something you have seen many times before, exactly what I was looking at. I said, "Patricia, I authorized none of those transfers." She said, "We suspected that might be the case. Mr. Holloway, do you know who has access to your account credentials?" I thought about the question. I thought about one person. I said, "I need to call you back." I hung up the phone. I sat in my kitchen for a long time. Outside, March was doing what March does. Undecided, gray, not yet willing to commit to anything. I thought about Gerald, my brother-in-law, the man I had trusted, the man I had given access to my accounts 14 months ago, when my wife Carol was sick, and I was at the hospital every day, and I needed someone I trusted to handle the routine financial management while I was otherwise occupied. I thought about Gerald's voice on the phone last week, the careful ease of it, the specific careful ease of someone who is managing a performance. I thought about 38 years of federal financial compliance work. I thought about what I knew, and I thought about what I was going to do with what I knew. My name is Frank Holloway. I am 67 years old. I spent 38 years as an accountant with specialization in financial compliance, fraud detection, and for 11 of those years as a consultant to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. I have helped build cases that put people in federal prison. I know exactly how it is done. And Gerald Marsh had stolen my retirement savings. He had stolen from the wrong man. Let me tell you who I am before I tell you what happened. Because the version of me that existed in Gerald's understanding, and in the understanding of most people who saw me as Carol's quiet, methodical, slightly boring husband, and the version that actually existed, were two very different people. In Gerald's understanding, I was Frank, Carol's husband, the accountant, the man who wore the same 3 ties in rotation and drove a sensible car, and whose idea of excitement was a well-organized spreadsheet and a cup of tea at exactly 4:30. He was not entirely wrong about the ties, but he was wrong about everything else. The full picture is this. I grew up in a household where money was not managed well. My father was a generous man and a careless one, and by the time I was 14, I had watched generosity and carelessness produce consequences that a family takes a long time to recover from. I decided at 14 that I would understand money completely, not to accumulate it, but to never be surprised by it. I became an accountant. I became a very good one. In 1989, I was approached by a colleague who worked in conjunction with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, the branch of the IRS that investigates financial crimes, not tax preparation errors, not honest mistakes, fraud, money laundering, embezzlement, the deliberate and systematic theft of money through the manipulation of financial systems. They needed people who understood financial systems from the inside. I spent 11 years as a consultant to that division. I am not able to discuss the specifics of the cases I worked on. What I can tell you is that over 11 years, I learned how financial crimes are constructed, the specific methods, the patterns, the signatures that distinguish deliberate fraud from genuine error, the paper trails that seem to disappear, and the places they actually go. I retired from that work in 2003. I continued in private accounting practice for another 16 years. I retired fully in 2019. And I spent the following 4 years doing what I had always planned to do, being present for Carol, who had given me 39 years of marriage and deserved my complete attention, and tending a vegetable garden that I was considerably better at planning than executing. Carol was diagnosed with cancer in the autumn of 2022. She was treated. She fought it with the specific, focused determination she brought to everything. She is in remission now. I want to say that clearly, because the story I am about to tell you is not a story of loss. It is a story of what happens when someone takes advantage of love. In the winter of 2022, while Carol was in treatment and I was spending most of my days at the hospital and most of my evenings managing the practical administration of a life that had temporarily reorganized itself around medical schedules, I made a decision. I needed help, not emotional help. I had people for that. I had Carol's sister Patricia and our son Daniel, and a community of friends who showed up in exactly the ways that communities show up when something serious is happening. I needed practical help, financial management, the routine transfers, the bill payments, the account monitoring that I did not have the hours to maintain while I was where I needed to be. Gerald said, "Frank, let me help. I'll handle it." Gerald Marsh, Carol's brother, 62 years old, a financial advisor, which is relevant, who had worked in financial services for 25 years, and who had, in my experience of him, always presented as competent and trustworthy. He had been my brother-in-law for 39 years. I gave him limited access to the accounts, limited access to manage routine payments, not to transfer funds, not to move money between accounts, not to do any of what he did. I should have known. The precise and particular truth is, I should have known. Not because Gerald had ever given me a specific reason to distrust him, but because 38 years of working in financial compliance had taught me one thing above all others. The most dangerous access you can give anyone is convenient access, because convenient access removes the friction that makes theft difficult. I was preoccupied, I was frightened, I was a husband whose wife was ill and whose attention was exactly where it should have been, and whose professional instincts were, for the first time in 38 years, not where they should have been. Gerald noticed, and Gerald acted on it. I want to be precise about what Gerald did, because precision matters in this kind of story, and because the details are not merely interesting, they are the architecture of what came next. The access I had given Gerald was to a bill payment account, a current account, not the retirement account, not the investment portfolio, the bill payment account, with a balance sufficient to cover 6 months of household expenses, and with explicit instructions that this was its purpose. What Gerald did was this. He used the bill payment account correctly for the first 2 months. He paid the bills. He kept records. He sent me monthly summaries that were accurate and appropriate. In the 3rd month, he began to explore. I know this now from the bank records, which I have reviewed in the specific detail that 38 years of forensic accounting makes possible. In the 3rd month, he began accessing the online banking portal with increasing frequency, not just for payments, but looking, reading, mapping the structure of my accounts. In the 4th month, he moved money, not from the bill payment account, which he was authorized to access, from the retirement account. To understand how he did this, you need to understand something about the specific vulnerability he exploited. In 2022, my bank had a consolidated online portal, one login that allowed visibility across all linked accounts. The access I had given Gerald was to one account, but the portal showed all accounts, and the transfer functionality in that portal version required only portal access, not specific account authorization for internal transfers below a certain threshold. Gerald had found the gap. He transferred money from my retirement account 17 times, in amounts that were calibrated, and this is important. This is the detail that confirmed to me exactly what I was dealing with. Calibrated to remain below the automatic reporting thresholds, below the amounts that trigger bank alerts, below the amounts that the system flags as unusual. Gerald had spent 25 years in financial services. He knew where the lines were. He stayed beneath them. For 8 months he stayed beneath them, until Patricia from the fraud department called me on a Thursday morning in March. I want to tell you what I felt in the minutes after that call. Not anger, not immediately, something colder than anger. The specific, cold clarity of someone who has spent 38 years looking at financial crimes and who has just recognized one with the same certainty that a doctor recognizes a familiar disease. I knew what this was. I knew how it was done. And I knew, with the complete professional certainty of someone who has helped build federal cases from exactly this kind of starting point, what could be done about it. I picked up my phone. I did not call Gerald. I called my former colleague at the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. Her name was Sandra Reeves. She had retired 2 years before me and had then returned as a senior consultant. She answered on the second ring. I said, "Sandra, I have a situation. I need 20 minutes of your time." She said, "Tell me." I told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Frank, how complete is your documentation?" I said, "I have 3 months of bank statements. I have the access logs from the portal. I have the original authorization agreement I gave him, which specifies exactly what he was and was not permitted to do." She said, "When did you find out?" I said, 45 minutes ago." She said, "And you haven't contacted him?" I said, "No." She said, "Good." "Don't," she said. "Frank, this is wire fraud. Across state lines, if any of those transfers went through the national processing system, which they almost certainly did, that's federal." I said, "I know." She said, "I'm going to make 2 calls. Don't do anything until you hear from me." I said, "Understood." I put the kettle on. I made tea. 4:30. I sat at my kitchen table with my tea and my 38 years and a fraud I could see as clearly as a building plan. And I waited. I want to tell you about Gerald properly, because this story deserves the full picture, and the full picture of Gerald Marsh is more complicated than a simple villain. He was 62 years old. He had worked in financial services for 25 years, first at a regional bank, then at an independent advisory firm that he had built with 2 partners in the late 90s, and that had, by its peak, managed a reasonable book of business. Then the partnership had fractured. I knew some of this. Carol had told me pieces of it over the years, with the specific loyalty of a sister who is also honest, giving me the shape of the situation without the editorializing. The partnership had ended badly. Gerald's portion of the client book had shrunk. There had been legal disputes that I knew about in outline and whose details Carol had never fully shared because they were not her details to share. What I knew, in the months before he offered to help me, was that Gerald was not in the financial position he had once been in. The advisory firm was smaller now. The disputes had been costly. He was 62 and had made the specific kind of financial decisions that a man makes when he is certain his peak is still ahead of him, and that has been, quietly, behind him for a while. He needed money. That is the simple fact underneath everything. He needed money, and he had access, and he had 25 years of knowing exactly how to move money in ways that look routine. And he had a brother-in-law who was distracted by love. I do not forgive him for this. I want to be clear about that, because the full picture does not require forgiveness. Understanding a thing is not the same as accepting it. Gerald made choices. He made them deliberately. and with professional precision. The fact that he needed money does not alter the fact that he stole it. But I understand how he got there, which is different. And understanding how he got there told me something useful. Gerald was not panicking. Gerald believed he was safe. He had stayed below the thresholds. He had kept his records tidy. He had, as far as he knew, covered his tracks in exactly the ways that 25 years of financial services had taught him to cover them. He did not know what I knew. He did not know that I could read his work the way a craftsman reads another craftsman's, seeing not just the product, but the method, seeing not just what was moved, but how, and when, and why those specific amounts, and what they revealed about his understanding of the system he had exploited. He did not know that the specific calibration of his transfers, the careful management of thresholds, was not a sign of sophistication. It was a signature. In forensic financial work, sophisticated criminals make the mistake of being too careful. The calibration itself becomes evidence of intent. A genuine accounting error does not calibrate to threshold limits. Only deliberate fraud does. Gerald's carefulness was his confession. He just didn't know it yet. He called me on the Saturday after the Thursday bank call. I answered. He said, "Frank, how's Carol?" I said, "She's well, getting stronger." He said, "Good, good. I was thinking about coming over next week to go through the accounts with you, now that things are settling down." I said, "That would be good." He said, "Great. Tuesday?" I said, "Tuesday works." I said it the way you say things when you are 67 years old and have spent 38 years in rooms with people who are lying to you, and you have learned that the calmest voice in the room is usually the one that knows the most. He said, "See you then." He hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand. Sandra had called me on Friday. She had made her 2 calls. Tuesday was going to be a different kind of meeting than Gerald was expecting. Sandra Reeves and I worked through the weekend. Not physically. She was in another city and we worked by phone and secure document sharing. But we worked. I pulled every record I had access to. Bank statements going back 14 months. Portal access logs, which the bank provided when I contacted their fraud department with a formal request. The original authorization document I had given Gerald, which I had written myself, and which was specific, clear, and unambiguous about the scope of what he was permitted to do. 38 years of forensic accounting do not stop being useful when you retire. I built the timeline first, month by month, transfer by transfer. I documented each transaction, its date, the amount, the source account, the destination account, and the relationship of each amount to the relevant regulatory thresholds. The pattern was unambiguous. Every transfer was calibrated. Not one exceeded the threshold that would have triggered automatic reporting. The amounts varied, not randomly, but in a way that suggested Gerald was distributing across multiple reporting parameters simultaneously. He was not just staying below one threshold, he was staying below 3. That level of calibration requires knowledge. It requires deliberate calculation. It is not the behavior of someone who made a mistake or misunderstood the scope of their access. It is the behavior of someone who understands the system and has made a considered decision to exploit it. I documented all of this with the specific precision that the work requires, not for emotional satisfaction, for utility. A document that will be used in a federal proceeding needs to be built to a standard, and I knew the standard. Sandra reviewed my documentation on Sunday evening. She said, "Frank, this is clean." I said, "I know." She said, "It's almost textbook." I said, "That's what I thought." She said, "The destination accounts. Do you know where the money went?" I said, "I have the account numbers from the transfer records. I can't access the destination accounts directly. But the numbers have routing information." Sandra said, "2 of them appear to be registered to a business entity. We're looking into it." I said, "What kind of entity?" She said, Something registered in the last 18 months. A consulting firm with no public profile. I said, Gerald, she said, almost certainly. Which moves this from unauthorized access to deliberate structuring and wire fraud. I said, federal. She said, definitively federal. I said, what happens next? She said, I've already been in contact with the relevant field office. Frank, you know how this works. The moment we involve a federal agency, it moves at their pace, not ours. I said, I understand. She said, can you sit on this until Tuesday without contacting him? I said, I have been sitting on things my entire career. I can sit on this until Tuesday. She said, there may be someone who wants to be present Tuesday. I said, how present? She said, present in the sense of being outside your house when Gerald arrives, and potentially inside shortly after. I said, Sandra. She said, Frank, this is wire fraud across state lines. 17 counts, against a man with professional credentials who knew exactly what he was doing. This is not something that waits. I said, all right, she said, Tuesday morning, 10 o'clock, be home. I said, I'll make tea. She said, make enough for several people. I said, how many? She said, more than 2. Tuesday morning. I was in the kitchen at 8:30. I had slept adequately, which surprised me, but I have spent a career making decisions under pressure, and I have learned that adequate sleep is a professional discipline rather than a natural gift, and I applied the discipline. I made breakfast. I made tea. At 9:15, Carol came downstairs. She had been in remission for 4 months and was in that specific stage of recovery where she was stronger than she had been and not yet as strong as she was going to be. A stage that requires a particular kind of patience that Carol has always had, in greater supply than I have. She sat at the kitchen table. She said, you've been up since 6. I said, I have some things to manage this morning. She said, Gerald is coming. I said, yes. She said, Frank. I said, Carol. She said, how bad is it? I looked at my wife. 39 years of marriage. The woman who had understood me with the specific completeness of someone who has been paying close attention for a very long time. I said, it's significant. She said, how significant? I said, the number Patricia gave me from the bank. Carol was quiet. She knew the number. I had told her on Friday evening, calmly, over dinner, because Carol deserves to know the things that concern her, and her brother concerns her. She had been quiet then too. Then she had said, he needs money. He has for a while. I said, I know. She said, that doesn't make it right. I said, no, it doesn't. She said, what are you going to do? I had told her, in general terms, what I was going to do. She had listened. She had said, the FBI. I said, if it goes federal, which it almost certainly will. She had been quiet for a long time. Then she said, he's my brother. I said, I know. She said, and he stole from us. I said, yes. She said, do what you need to do, Frank. She had not said it with anger. She had said it with the quiet weight of someone who has made a decision that costs them something and has made it clearly anyway. That was Carol. On Tuesday morning at 9:45, she took her tea and went to the sitting room. She said she would be there if I needed her. She said she would not be there if I didn't. I said, I'll come and get you when it's appropriate. She said, all right. At 10 o'clock precisely, Gerald was always precise about punctuality, which I had always found a characteristic worth noting. His car turned into the driveway. I watched from the kitchen window. He parked. He got out. He was carrying a leather folder, the kind that suggests organized professional engagement, the kind you carry when you want to project competence. He walked to the front door. He rang the bell. I opened it. He said, Frank, good to see you. The specific warmth of someone performing warmth. I said, Gerald, come in. He came in. I took his coat. I led him to the kitchen table. I poured tea. He set the leather folder on the table. He said, "So, now that things are calming down, how is Carol doing?" I said, "She's stronger. Thank you for asking." He said, "Good, good." A pause. "I thought we could go through the last few months. Make sure everything is in order before you take back full control of the accounts." I said, "Yes, I'd like to go through the last few months." I reached under the table. I had a folder of my own. I placed it on the table between us. He looked at it. He looked at me. I said, "Gerald, I want to show you something." I opened the folder. I placed the timeline document on the table, month by month, transfer by transfer, every amount, every date, every destination account number. He looked at it. I watched his face. 25 years of financial services produces a very good poker face. I will give him that. For approximately 4 seconds, he maintained it. Then, something happened in his eyes. Not guilt exactly. The specific expression of someone who has just understood that the calculation they were running was based on wrong assumptions. He said, "Frank," I said, "I built the timeline over the weekend. 17 transfers, 8 months, calibrated to stay below the BSA reporting threshold, the FinCEN structuring threshold, and the bank's internal alert parameter, all 3 simultaneously. That level of calibration is not accidental, Gerald. That's professional." He said, "Frank, I can explain." I said, "The destination accounts, 2 of them route to a business entity registered 18 months ago. The entity has no public profile, no website, no listed employees. It appears to exist primarily as a receiving account." He said, "I was going to pay it back." I said, "Gerald." He stopped. I said, "I'm going to ask you to listen for a moment." He was quiet. I said, "I have spent 38 years in financial compliance, 11 of those years as a consultant to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. I have helped build federal cases. I know how they are constructed. I know what 17 counts of wire fraud across state lines looks like in a federal filing. I know what the sentencing guidelines are. I know what happens when a man with professional credentials, a licensed financial advisor, commits deliberate structured theft against a family member." His face. I had seen that expression before, not on Gerald specifically, but on people who have been certain of their safety and have just been shown that their certainty was wrong. I said, "There are people outside this house right now." He said nothing. I said, "I am not telling you this to frighten you. I am telling you because you deserve to know what you are walking into." He said, "Frank, we're family." I said, "Yes, we are, which is why I am sitting here telling you this, instead of simply letting the process proceed without your knowing. You stole from us, Gerald, from Carol, while she was ill. While I was sitting at a hospital watching my wife fight for her life, you were using access I gave you in trust to take our retirement savings." The kitchen was very quiet. Gerald looked at the table. His leather folder was still closed. I said, "The doorbell is going to ring in approximately 3 minutes. He looked up. I said, "I want to ask you one question before it does." He said, "What?" I said, "Was there ever a moment when you considered stopping?" He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, quietly, "Yes." I said, "When?" He said, "When Carol's treatment started working." I said, "But you didn't stop." He said, "No." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because by then I had already—" He stopped. "I had already used it." I said, "All right." The doorbell rang. I went to the front door. 2 agents from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, a man and a woman, professional, measured, the specific composure of people who do this work regularly and have no interest in performing it. I said, "Come in, he's in the kitchen." They came in. They went to the kitchen. I followed. What happened next? was not dramatic in the way that television has trained people to expect these things to be dramatic. There were no raised voices. There were no handcuffs placed dramatically on a kitchen table. There was a very calm, very professional conversation in which the agents introduced themselves, explained the nature of the investigation, and informed Gerald of his rights with the complete precision that the law requires. Gerald sat at my kitchen table. He did not speak. He did not reach for his lawyer. He simply sat there. And something happened to his face in that kitchen that I have thought about many times since. It collapsed. Not dramatically, not into tears, though those came later, but the performance, the careful ease, the managed expression, the 25 years of professional surfaces came apart. What was left underneath was a 62-year-old man who had made a series of decisions that he had believed were manageable and had discovered they were not. I had seen that before too. It does not produce satisfaction, exactly. What it produces is something quieter, the specific quietness of a situation that has reached its correct conclusion. The agents took Gerald's statement. They took the leather folder. They took a copy of my documentation, which they had already received from Sandra's contact, but which they noted and confirmed. Before they left, one of the agents, the woman, whose name was Agent Torres, said to me, "Mr. Holloway, you built a very clean file." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Most victims in situations like this don't have the professional background to document it this way." I said, "Most victims didn't spend 11 years with the Criminal Investigation Division." She looked at me. She said, "Sandra mentioned that." I said, "Sandra is thorough." She almost smiled. They left. Gerald was not arrested that morning. The process does not work that way. What happened was the beginning of a federal investigation, the formal initiation of a process that would take months to complete and that I understood, from 38 years of professional experience, would proceed at exactly the pace it was designed to proceed. I closed the front door. I went to the kitchen. I made more tea. Then I went to the sitting room where Carol was. She was in her chair by the window, the one she had occupied during the months of treatment, with her tea and a book she was not reading. She looked at me. I said, "It's done. The beginning of it." She said, "How is he?" I said, "Not well." She said, "Frank." I said, "Carol." She said, "He's my brother." I said, "I know." She said, "I know what he did. I'm not asking you to forgive him. I'm asking how he is." I said, "He looked like a man who has understood something he should have understood much earlier." She was quiet. I sat in the chair across from her. Outside, the March morning was still doing what March does, undecided, grey, not yet willing to commit. She said, "What happens now?" I said, "The investigation proceeds. It will take time. There will be a legal process." She said, "And our money?" I said, "Asset recovery is part of the process." Sandra's contact mentioned the business entity, the destination accounts. If the money is there, it can be recovered. Not all of it necessarily, but significant portions. She said, "And if it's gone?" I said, "Then we live on what we have, and we are fine. We have always been careful, Carol. 39 years of being careful." She said, "Gerald was never careful." I said, "No." She said, "He was always the one who was going to make it big, and never quite did." I said, "Yes." She said, "I always felt sorry for him." I said, "I know you did." She said, "I still do." I said, "That's because you're a better person than the situation requires." She looked at me. She said, "Frank?" I said, "Carol." She said, "Put the kettle on." I put the kettle on. The investigation took 8 months. I will not take you through all of them in detail because the details are partly confidential and partly simply procedural, and procedure is not where this story lives. What I will tell you is the shape of it. Gerald cooperated. This surprised me less than it might surprise you. I have seen, over 38 years, that cooperation is the most common response of people with professional credentials who have committed financial crimes, once they understand the full extent of what they are facing. The calculation shifts. The cooperation becomes the best available option. He had legal representation within 24 hours. His attorney was competent and realistic. The cooperation agreement that was negotiated included full disclosure of the destination accounts, the business entity, and the movement of funds. The money was largely recoverable, not all of it. Gerald had used a portion. The legal process would determine the exact figures, but the majority of what he had taken was in the receiving accounts, and the receiving accounts were accessible through the federal process. We recovered 83%. 83% of what was taken from us, returned, through a process that took 8 months and that I monitored with the specific professional attention of someone who knows how to read federal financial proceedings and does not require explanations. The remaining 17%, Gerald's legal team argued that it had been spent on legitimate business expenses for the consulting entity, which was a creative argument that the federal prosecutors found less than fully compelling. The exact disposition of that portion is still being determined as of when I am telling you this story. What Gerald received was not a comfortable outcome. I will not detail it, because it is not mine to detail. It belongs to a federal case that has official records. What I will say is that what he received was what the law provides for 17 counts of wire fraud committed by a licensed financial professional against a family member. It was sufficient. I am not going to tell you that justice was complete or perfect. Justice is rarely complete or perfect. It is a mechanism, and mechanisms are imperfect by nature. What the mechanism produced in this case was accountability, and accountability is what I had asked of it, and it delivered. Carol and Gerald have not spoken. This is Carol's decision, and I respect it completely. She told me, 3 months after the Tuesday morning, I don't know if there's a version of this where I speak to him again. I need more time. I said, take whatever time you need. She said, do you think I should forgive him? I said, I think forgiveness is something you do for yourself, not for the person who wronged you. And I think you'll know when and whether it's right. And until then, you don't owe anyone a timeline. She said, that's a very accountant answer. I said, I am a very accountant person. She said, I know. It's one of the things I love about you. It is 14 months after Patricia's call from the bank fraud department. The investigation is concluded. The legal proceedings have taken their course. The recovery process is in its final stages. Carol is in full remission. This is the most important thing, and I want to say it clearly, at the end of a story that has contained difficult things. My wife is well. She is gardening again, which she approaches with considerably more competence than I approach it. She has opinions about the vegetable beds that I have learned, over 40 years, to receive as the expert guidance they are. We had Sunday dinner with our son Daniel last week. He had followed the situation from a distance, close enough to be informed, far enough to respect that it was ours to handle. He is 44 years old and has his mother's instinct for reading people and my preference for not saying something until there is something useful to say. Over dinner, he said, Dad, how are you actually? I said, honestly? He said, honestly? I said, I am 67 years old. I have 38 years of professional experience that I applied to a situation in which someone I trusted violated that trust. The situation has been addressed through the correct channels. Your mother is in remission. The garden is producing more tomatoes than either of us can eat. I am, honestly, all right. He said, that's also a very accountant answer. I said, your mother said the same thing. He said, we know you. Carol said, we do. We ate dinner. It was a good dinner. After, Daniel helped me clear the table. which he has done since he was 7 years old, and which I have never had to ask for, and will never take for granted. He said quietly over the dishes, "Did you know when you gave Gerald access that it might go wrong?" I said, "I had a professional instinct that I chose to override." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because he was family, and because your mother needed help and he offered it, and because there are moments when you choose to trust the person over the instinct. And sometimes that's right, and sometimes it costs you." He said, "Are you sorry you trusted him?" I thought about that. I said, "I am sorry about what he did with the trust. I am not sorry that I gave it. I would rather be the person who extends trust and gets it wrong than the person who never extends trust and never gets it wrong." He said, "That's not a very accountant answer." I said, "No, that's a different answer, from a different part." He said, "Which part?" I said, "The part that has been married to your mother for 39 years. He smiled. He finished the dishes. I dried. "I want to leave you with something true. Gerald did not succeed because he was clever. He succeeded, temporarily, because he chose a moment when the person he was stealing from was looking somewhere else. He chose the moment when I was a husband before I was an accountant, and in that sense, he almost chose correctly, almost. Because what he did not account for, and this is not about my professional background, this is about something simpler, was that the moment I was not watching my accounts, I was watching my wife. I was watching Carol. I was paying attention to the most important thing in my life. And people who are paying attention to the most important things have a quality that is very difficult to fool for very long. They come back. They always come back. I came back to the accounts. I came back to the professional instincts I had set aside. I came back with 38 years of expertise that had been quietly waiting for me to need it again. And when I came back, I built a file, a clean one. What I want to say to anyone listening who has been the target of financial fraud, by a family member, by a trusted person, by anyone who exploited a moment of vulnerability, is this: document everything. Date, time, amount, account, destination. Every transaction, every communication, every piece of paper. Build your record from whatever you have and take it to the right people. The right people exist. They are professionals who do this work and who have the authority and the tools to act on a well-documented case. Your expertise is not required. Your documentation is. And to anyone who is in a moment of vulnerability right now, in a hospital, or a difficult season, or a period of life where the practical things are slipping because the important things require your full attention, be careful about what access you give and to whom. Not because everyone will do what Gerald did. Most people will not do what Gerald did. But convenient access removes the friction that makes theft difficult. And some people, when the friction is removed, make choices they would not otherwise make. Trust carefully, document everything, and come back. Always come back. Carol is in the garden this morning. I can see her from the kitchen window. She is doing something with the rose bed that she has not fully explained to me, which is her standard approach to garden operations. Act first, explain later, allow me to observe the results. I have learned, over 40 years, that this is a valid methodology. The March morning outside is doing what March eventually does. It has committed. The light is clean and cold and specific in the way that only March light is. I am going to take Carol a cup of tea. I am going to sit on the bench by the rose bed, and I am going to spend the next hour watching someone I love do something she is very good at. That is the whole of it. That is enough. I'll see you in the next one.